Bonsoir à tous. Merci d'être ici. Bienvenue. Je vais juste
Welcome.
pour la traduction.
Before we get going, let's briefly run down how the interpretation will work. You have headsets and a receiver. You can select the channel you would like to listen to.
Vincenzo Vinzi, qui est le
We have Mr.
directeur
Vincenzo
général de
Vinzi, who
l'ESSEC.
is Director
Bonne
General
soirée.
of l'ESSEC, to get things going. Have a good evening.
Chères étudiantes, chers étudiants,
Dear students, ladies and
dear
gentlemen,
students, ladies and gentlemen, bienvenue et welcome.
welcome
Je
everyone.
suis très heureux de vous accueillir toutes et tous ce
I
soir.
am delighted to be with you here all this evening for this exceptional event.
15 femmes leaders
We have 15 Afghan women who are leaders in Afghanistan in all fields, from politics to media, including development, security and law.
l'association étudiante.
I would also like to commend the Student Association, the Mardis de l'ESSEC, their chairwoman Laura Baldon, and their entire team that helped organize this event, which rounds out the year in a beautiful way. So congratulations and thank you.
Je remercie également nos invités de marque qui
I'd
nous
also
font
like to
l'honneur
thank
de leur
our
présence à nos
guests
côtés ce soir.
who are honoring us with their presence. We have Mr. David Martinon, Ambassador from France to Afghanistan, Mr. Staffan de Mistura, former Special Representative of the UN to Afghanistan and Syria, and Mr. Omar Samad, former
Je remercie enfin très
Afghan
chaleureusement
Ambassador to France.
et Tina
I would also
Robiol
like to
pour
warmly
leur
thank
rôle majeur
Femi and Tina Robiol for their
l'organisation de cet
major
événement
role that they
et
played
pour
in
leur
organizing this
engagement
event,
dans la
and
formation
also
des
for
femmes
their
leaders
commitment
afghanes,
to
qui est
helping
décisif pour
train
construire l'avenir de ce
women
pays
leaders in
soumis
Afghanistan who will
depuis
play
des
a
décennies
vital
à des
role
déchirements
in
violents.
rebuilding the country that has been torn
Merci à
apart for
toutes
so many
et
years.
tous d'être venus nombreux ce
Thank
soir.
you, one
La
and all, for
diffusion
coming in
directe à
this
l'étranger,
evening.
notamment à Washington,
And we also
signe
are
que le sujet que nous
being
abordons ce
followed
soir est
live in
d'intérêt
Washington, which
pour une
shows
telle
just how
communauté.
important to so many
Sans plus
people
attendre,
this topic is.
j'invite Femi
Without further ado, I would like to ask Femi to come and join me here on stage so that we can together welcome the 15 women who have come from Afghanistan to receive training here at l'ESSEC. Ana Keri Honayor,
فرشته کریم دکتر ثریا صبحرنگ متر فرشته کریمی ناجیه بابکرخیل député de Paktika. Madame Soghra Sadat. Madame Atife Tayeb. Farahnoz Furutan, journaliste. Homeira Ayoubi, ancien député. Dr Roshanak Fardak. Shahgul Rezai, député. Madame Dr Farideh Momand, ancien ministre à l'enseignement supérieur et candidate à vice-présidence. Madame Marie Akrami. Madame Massoudeh Kalouri, députée de Herat. Et Madame Palvache Hassan.
This evening, we are particularly delighted to be hosting this conference because it is very similar to the reason this school exists, which is to give meaning to the leadership of tomorrow. What better way to achieve that goal than to be part of the training of these Afghan women who will, in the future, be leaders in their country and to bring a new lease of life to it. As a business school, it is our duty to have a global impact in business, of course, but also on society. And that applies to ESSEC's roots in France, but also to other countries around the world. We have campuses in Singapore and Morocco. And we also have presence around the world through our alumnus network. This impact brings life to our values, the excellency that we experience every day, and also our responsibility and caring, which are at the heart of our DNA since 1907. Indeed, the next generation of people and of companies are more and more careful about the impact of their actions and expect from higher education institutions such as business schools support in facing the challenges of tomorrow. Through this debate with women leaders from Afghanistan, we are showing the role of women in society. This is a challenge that faces not just Afghanistan, but also France and all the countries around the world. We should be happy that equality between men and women is something that is at the forefront of actions of companies and governments around the world. That being said, we must not let the pressure slip, because the road towards equality is long and requires access to training, equality in incomes and career opportunities, which are real issues for professors and researchers at business schools such as ESSEC. That is why our school is committed through innovative initiatives such as the European Board Ready program that gives women the tools to get onto the management boards of big European companies. I would like to once again thank all the participants of this meeting today, and I would also like to invite to stage Mr. David Martinon, French ambassador to Afghanistan, to take the floor. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the debate. Good evening, everyone. I felt that maybe the most useful thing for you would be to take a step back and look at what the situation is today in Afghanistan, with some very simple figures. Afghanistan today, and these are rankings that are set up by independent NGOs, Afghanistan today is the country where terrorism kills the most people in the world through attacks in Kabul and elsewhere. Afghanistan is also the country in the world where there are the most victims of war. 1/3 of war victims in the world are in Afghanistan. If you take Syria, you add to it the casualties in the war in Yemen, and you get to Afghanistan. It's also the country where most journalists have been killed. That was the case in 2018, and it looks like that trend is unlikely to be bucked in 2019. We left Kabul at the end of Ramadan, at Eid, and it was a devastating period. There was on average one terrorist attack per day in Kabul, using all of the methods terrorists can use: trapped vehicles, suicide bombers, magnetic bombs on cars, bombing mosques. We saw absolutely everything. There is a peace process, and this peace process is trying to take root. And today it would be understandable to become discouraged, but we should not. There are two parts to this peace process. There is the American Taleb part of the peace process, which has made some inroads but is stagnant today. And then there is the inter-Afghan peace process that we support but has not yet really started to date. There have been some meetings, but meetings between delegates that didn't really have any legitimacy or mandate to push forward on the debate. So today, a lot remains to be done. What we, the international community in Kabul, want is a negotiation that is truly inclusive. The Taleb delegation today is quite well organized. There are 11 of them. You've got the leader. There are very few people who actually speak around the table. They know where they're going, and they are disciplined and organized in their approach. As to Afghanistan as a legal entity, maybe people are trusting the way, the Afghan Oya Jega way, which is to bring everyone together to speak, and people believe that you can solve any issue through this process. Unfortunately, it has not yet proven itself in the current situation, and that is why we are doing everything we can to convince people in Kabul that the discussion must be inclusive, which means that for legal Afghanistan, the government needs to be represented. Otherwise, there's no point in claiming you want to defend the constitution if you're excluding the government. You also need to have the opposition, because this isn't just a governmental negotiation, it's for the whole state. And we firmly believe that civil society must also be involved in these negotiations. What I mean by that is representatives of 48% of the Afghan population, women. That is of vital importance, and that is why we have undergone this process with Fahmy and Tina. We have selected each individual here, each woman here has been selected because we believe that it is vital not only that women are a part of the negotiation, but also that they have a structural role in the future of the country. This is all the more important that we believe that the Taliban must realize in this environment of confrontation that they're not out of the woods. They may well control 25 to 32% of the territory in the country, depending on the season. They control these regions through fear. They subjugate the populations, in some provinces at least, but they do not have the support of the people. The people are not behind them, because you shouldn't forget, the Afghan people do not forget, and especially Afghan women do not forget. So it's important that the Taliban discuss things with women, and it is important that they realize they must win their trust, and therefore that they must change to win that trust. It's not going to be easy. But I would also like to say that by being part of this discussion, Afghan women are changing the political landscape in Kabul. That is important because it is a revolution in and of itself. There are more women in parliament, and through their role, they are changing the narrative in Afghanistan. We want to avoid regular steps back that lead to habits and codes and practices that objectively shouldn't exist come back. And it is through their example, through their strength, through their intelligence, that they will be able to move us forward. When I see leaders in Kabul, especially the most conservative amongst them, I tell them that there's no point in leaving women outside or confining them to the kitchen, because no matter where they are in the world, women are gradually coming into power around the world, and that is a good thing. There is no organization in the world that works less well because it is more diverse. It's the opposite. This is a management school. This is a diverse organization, and they know here that a diverse organization is always better than a non-diverse one. And that is why we support this action, we support this program, and we believe it is very important. And ladies, we are placing our hopes in you, in what you can do, and in a couple of days, when we go back to Kabul, you can continue to count on our help, and we will be there to help you. And in the meantime, I'm sure that everyone is very interested to see what you have been doing. Thank you for your invitation.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you,
Je suis Tina Robiol.
Your Excellency. My name is Tina Robiol, and with Faime, we are delighted to have this opportunity to organize this event for you. And we'd like to share a few words with you before we get into the debate. I won't keep you for long now. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome. In 1919, Afghanistan decided to declare war on the UK to get out of its control. This led to, in August 1919, a peace treaty, and this year is the 100th anniversary of that event. We are delighted to have here a delegation of Afghan women leaders. Once again, welcome. This is the fourth time that we have had the honor and the opportunity of being partners with ESSEC to organize this kind of event. In 2011, we worked with the student organization at ESSEC to organize a first meeting with women Afghan leaders, one of whom is back again after 2011. Les Mardis de l'ESSEC is the student organization. They're a real amazing organization, and they're 50 years old this year. So we turned towards them once again to organize this event. Through its know-how, l'ESSEC has always supported us. Mr. Dean of the school, Mr. Lenzo, thank you once again for being with us today. Without you and without your people, we would not have been able to organize this event. It should be stated here before the audience that your team was amazingly effective, but also amazingly benevolent, which is something that we are trying to spread through this program. Your teams support us as we worked on this initiative, which aims to get the voices of these women leaders heard, and to also to strengthen their contribution and their impact on the governance and well-being in their country. The flag of Afghanistan, you may have seen it outside, is now flying next to the French flag and the European flag, and that is a strong symbol in our opinion. We were all quite emotional when we saw that flag flying outside l'ESSEC. Today, the international community seems less interested by the situation in Afghanistan. However, the Ministry for Europe and for Foreign Affairs and the French Embassy, however, have shown us that France and Europe continue to support Afghanistan, especially in this key period of negotiation between the Taliban and the US. Those negotiations are being carried out, however, without the involvement of the Afghan people. Mr. Ambassador, myself and Faime would like to thank you for your trust and support that your that your departments have offered us. Through what we did in 2011, the French Parliament also became involved with a partnership group between France and Afghanistan that exists within the Parliament. This year, that partnership has also spread to the second chamber, the Senate, in the French Parliament. And our delegation will also be able to speak with French women political leaders here in France, and we'd like to thank them as well. A few words on the students now, and this is important to me because I'm an ESSEC alumnus myself, and when students come to the ESSEC school, it's to develop skills in accounting management, marketing, etc., and most of them aim to have a career in business. But there's something special about this school, which is open-mindedness and intellectual curiosity, which mean that the students go beyond just business and learn about the world around them. Geopolitics is taught here, and I think that's very important. Students at ESSEC, through the experience we've had with the Mardis de l'ESSEC organization, show that they have a desire to find the means to connect to the world around them, and not just in a way that will be profitable to them. Their enthusiasm, their know-how, and also their life skills should be underlined as particularly valuable, especially as they were undergoing their end-of-year exams during the same time. So thank you to you. Laura Baldon, Madam Chair, thank you, and congratulations for the efforts made by you and your team. And finally, this program wouldn't make sense without the high energy involvement from the members of our delegation. Ladies, you really helped us organizing this. Knowing the difficulties that you encounter every day, I know that leaving your country for a whole week to do this was not easy, so thank you for coming. Throughout these 4 days that we spent leading up to today, you have shown us that Afghan women have changed a lot since 2001. You've developed perseverance, critical thinking, determination, and Afghan women have also been able to develop their skill set and their knowledge of each other. That is a relationship that you will be able to keep beyond just this week. And you have also worked on strategies to convince people that you are indeed vital and you want to be taken into account. Beyond symbols, beyond quotas, you want to be heard by the international community and the men around you in Afghanistan and abroad. You have transmitted that enthusiasm to us, which kept us motivated up until now and for the future. And you will be equipped with tools to help you break through the barriers that you are experiencing and will experience in the future. Of course, the upcoming presidential elections, but also, more generally, the construction of a state that will be a stakeholder in peace negotiations going forward. We are counting on you and in Europe to continue to support these women. You will be traveling back to Afghanistan with concrete action plans that you've developed together and that you wish to implement in Afghanistan. And it is with a little bit of sadness but also optimism that we will continue to support you as you go back. Fahimi and myself would like to thank you and encourage you once again and finally to assure you of our fullest support. Thank you.
I'd now like to welcome Omar Samad, His Excellency, former Ambassador of Afghanistan to France, Canada, who will join us up on stage. And now I'd also like to welcome Mr. de Mistura, former Special Envoy of the UN to Syria, in charge of the UN mission in Afghanistan, as well as in other countries. Welcome. Over to you. I'm going to speak English in a moment, but I'd like to address my thanks in French, the country that had this wonderful idea to support with Madame Fahimé this initiative, and to thank the director of ESSEC.
I feel that this occasion is very timely. We are going through a very difficult moment. We will hear what the Afghan women will tell us. So I will just take the liberty of telling you why I'm here, and then a few points. I'm here because I'm worried, I'm concerned, and they are concerned. It's a concern that is shared by many, because we are afraid that what has been put in action for so many years may be lost. 3 points and 3 recommendations. The first point is, fly with me back 1996. Taliban arrived in Afghanistan. Suddenly, quickly, the situation of women, 51% of the population, changes. They cannot get out of house. They have to stay at home. They cannot go to school. They cannot work. And they will be punished brutally and in public. And then things change. When the coalition, led by the US, under Article 51, after 9/11, decided to move into Afghanistan. And very quickly, things changed. And look at today, now. Look around yourself. Each of these women are remarkable in their own right. We have little bit less than 1/3 of the parliamentarians are women. And together with the ex-ambassador to Kabul from France, we fought for the elections to insist that there should be a quota, 27%, at least, if not 30%. And we got it. And it was not easy. More or less than 1/3 of the civil servants are women in Afghanistan today. And professors, judges, politicians, candidates for being future vice president of this historically beautiful and proud country, and military and police people and journalists speaking up their own voice. They are women, and they are here with us. Now, the third point is that we all want peace. They want peace. We are tired, and they are even more tired than us, in what has been a terrible war, with thousands of people killed, especially Afghans, but many of our people, French, Americans, Italian, from every part of the world. So we agree, it's time for peace. And they did it because they insisted about 2014 with a unique initiative of having 400,000 people signing a signature and telling the man, stop this war. Our husbands, our children are being killed. So we all agree there is a need for a peace initiative, but we should not have that paying the price or going back to what it used to be and losing all what the women, 51% of the population, have been achieving during these 18 years. So 3 recommendations. These were the 3 points. The 3 recommendations. The first one is the women need to be at the table of the negotiations. So far, there have been 23 different meetings, and there have been 7, if I am not wrong, Ambassador, of meetings in Doha, with the future one coming. They are led by a very qualified, highly professional ambassador called Khalizad, very professional, on top of Afghan origin. But they are taking place with the Taliban. They need to be there too, because that is important for a stake, not only on behalf of women, but of men. So they need to be at the table, not on a side event, led and talking about women issues, but about the future of their country, because they are capable and willing to do so. The second element is that it needs to be, the issues of women's rights need to be on the official agenda, not, again, on the margins led by a woman who could have a meeting. No, on the real big agenda. And in writing, because we are all used to very good promises and then things don't take place. And the agenda is not just women's rights. They're asking for two principal things, and you will hear it. One is education. They need to have the right for education. That's why they are who they are, because they were able to be educated. And second, work. They should be allowed to work and not stay at home and told you have got a degree in jurisdiction or in law, but you stay at home. We cannot go back to that. Third point, let's remember that the US and its allies, and that's part, France is part of it, have still a lot of leverage. And I think the ambassador very rightly mentioned it. We are not yet there. The peace treaty has not yet been signed. So the leverage that the Americans have, Ambassador Khalilzad have, and the allies still is there. And they can and should be using it while we are negotiating, not after, when the promise is done and the thing is done, and then promises will not be maintained. Because the leverage can be political, diplomatic, and financial. And financial. Conclusion. We are proud to be with these women, believe me. I've seen these Afghan women, and not only them, they are representing them, fighting when there was no one to help them, maintaining their own determination when no one believed they could do it. They've been governors. They've been among the most difficult moments. One of them is actually living in a Taliban environment and being a doctor and treating everyone, both Talibans and the others, Afghans. So my bottom line is, we have to remember not to leave them alone. But, you know, not just because we should be generous, but we should remember that those who are old enough, like myself, to remember 9/11 actively, we also remember that we all became New Yorkers. We all joined the 9/11 response against what was a terrible attack. But we also did it not only because Mr. bin Laden was there and had done a horrible thing and was punished for that, but also because we didn't want to see any more women in burqas being stoned and punished. And that is still a danger. That's why this meeting today is an important one. Tashakkur. Thank you.
Alors, mesdames, messieurs les ambassadeurs, monsieur de Mistura, cher public, bonsoir, et bienvenue à ce nouveau et dernier débat du
Greetings, everyone.
ESSEC.
Welcome to this final debate of the ESSEC 2 days. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Mazar,
Collectif en conseil augmenté
with Weave and Compagnie de Falsbourg, builder and property developer, as well as our partners,
Faimé Robiol,
Faimé Robiol and the ESSEC group. Thanks to you all this evening for coming to Cergy to interact with us. So today's debate will have rather special format, as you probably saw, be divided into 3 panel sessions of 20 minutes each. The first will address the breakthroughs in Afghanistan since the fall of the Taliban regime in 2002, and then we'll turn to the regressions of the country since 2014, and then we'll finalize currently addressing the peace process underway and its consequences for the Afghan population. So before getting underway, we're going to get some air into this room. It might make a bit of a noise, but don't worry. So let's begin the first panel session. So after 9/11, the international community, notably the US, intervened in Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban government, accused of being complicit in organizing the attacks. Once the Taliban overthrown, the international community urged Afghanistan to lay the basis for a democratic system, notably in drawing up the 2004 constitution. This constitution instilled positive momentum to education, human rights, and democracy. Now, in terms of education, in 2003, we reached the record number of 4 million children enrolled in Afghan schools, and the following year, the state demonstrated through the constitution support for education by declaring education as a right for all Afghans and promoting women's education through the introduction of programs. Now, today, Najia Boho Kapel is Afghanistan continuing its education for all program, particularly for girls, sustainably in the most remote areas. Well, yes, as was said earlier, after the Taliban left, there were over 4,000 children in schools, and the situation was so dangerous that in the remote areas, not really in the town center, but the schools were closed. We were able to ensure that now there are 9 million children in school, and there are 3% who are women, and it wasn't easy. And for example, we were able to see that 18 years ago, there were young girls who were able to begin to work in the field of human rights in various organizations that are active now. That's an example, and then that's an achievement building on the work that has been undertaken lately, so we're able to secure those achievements. Now, these young people who were able to begin useful activities. Now, as regards the schools, we have over 15,000 schools in Afghanistan, and up until 2022, we can expect to have about another 1,000. So, I mean, that's going according to plan. We also have schools for reserved for young girls with the NGOs and the support of the international community who extended their help, and we were able to see the impact of that assistance and support. In a remote area where there are girls' schools, I'd say that there's a good organization for these girls, and in terms of the efficiency of the process, we've been able to bring in a significant number of teachers, which has had many beneficial effects, and organize courses, short courses to train the teachers and to make them more self-reliant. Now, in the field of education and training around education, we're able to make great strides in the media with the support of the international community to be able to communicate, inform, undertake outreach efforts. There are actually training organizations that are available. And that was transmitted by internet to disseminate that information. Of course, what we'd like is that all women, even in the remote areas or in the in unsecured areas should be able to access the training.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Ces avancées qu'ont connues les femmes sont
the breakthrough, the progress, I mean, that's stated in the Constitution. Article 22 states that men and women are equal in law and in rights. Article 53 states that the state must support vulnerable people, women without support. Fresh Karimi, aside from those changes in education, what significant improvements have affected Afghan women since the introduction of the Constitution?
یکی از بخش‌هایی که در 17 سال گذشته واقعاً پیشرفت‌های چشمگیری داشته در قسمت حقوق زنان و حضور زنان بوده که من به سه پیشرفت به سطح سه بخش اساسی اشاره میکنم که اولش قوانین است. قوانینی که البته به خاطر منافع زنان و به خاطر حقوق زنان و حضور زنان.
In terms of women rights and the presence of women, the first thing is actually the Constitution. So, I mean, the Afghan Constitution, Article 22, provides equal rights and secures, by virtue of the Constitution, against forms of aggression against women. We're able to see articles linked to women. They were able to be supported, and now women enjoy the same rights, have access to the same rights. For the second issue, which is women's presence in the political sphere, or as women's leaders, once again, the Constitution, there's some 7% of positions of MPs, of parliamentarians, are held by women. And today we've achieved 28%, so in fact we've exceeded the quota laid down by law in presence of women in the various offices, the dozens of women in the private sector, and this is something that we were able to achieve over the past 17 years. But of course, there are many areas where women are increasingly present, as was mentioned earlier. There are a great many women who are lawyers, who are active in the legal professions. That's very visible. Let me give you an example. In 2003, there were only 3 women judges, and now we have 4,500 present across the country, and that's a major achievement, principally for women, of course. And there's some 7% of women who are working in these offices who are women. So we've actually made significant breakthroughs, but we want that to continue and lastingly. So you say quite significant number of MPs in Parliament places. Afghanistan's 76. France has achieved 40% only since the 2017 elections. Before we were behind Afghanistan. So, Fechtay Karimi, to be a woman leader in politics today, is that a way of bringing together a society that seems riven by division, ethnic, cultural, for example? Yeah, of course, I've identified some laws, some legislation, but there are other pieces of legislation that solve problems linked to culture or religion. So we were able to prevent the application of undesirable forms of culture. So there are old laws that were a problem that we were able to work on, so that the law linked to the former culture that was in fact against our people, so we were able to overcome those deficiencies. Another major breakthrough achieved by democracy in Afghanistan, as we saw, was the holding since 2004 of many elections that met with considerable success, notably very good turnout on the part of women. So, Soria Obran, could you describe a symbolic day in Afghan democracy since the Constitution of 2004? Well, thank you for your question. We were able to make progress in terms of democracy. I could cite a few, but just before answering your question, I wanted to mention everything that pertains to democratic institutions, parliament, independent commissions for elections, the various election offices that are really the bedrock of democracy. And in our constitution, that's one of the most important aspects nationally. It was said that the president, MPs, senators, parliamentarians should be elected by the people, through the voice of the people. So that's a key point. The other point that I wanted to add is that by law, under our constitution, it's the first time that people, the right of the people as Afghans, that is a major achievement in terms of democracy. We have free speech, freedom of press, and freedom of political association. And what's important is, of course, the support of the state in international organizations, the UN for human rights. They abide by those precepts, and these 14 years we've signed a great many agreements, conventions with the international community. I'd like to now turn directly to your question. I can say that the greatest step forward that has been achieved in the memory of our people, the most significant day was the election, the first presidential election in Afghanistan, which on that day, young people, the elderly, the women went joyously to vote, to cast their vote for democracy with great hopes for the future. And that's why we have this result today, because you can speak now about Afghanistan. It's the elections as the bedrock for democracy is established, and that's a big achievement. Thank you.
Thank you. Let us now move on to media and journalism. Article 34 of the Afghan Constitution affirms that freedom of expression is an inalienable right, and every Afghan is free to print and to speak freely. However, the rest of the defense of journalism and media is in law. However, there are a lot of journalists who are still murdered today in Afghanistan, and freedom of expression is being questioned. Afghans have more and more access to informal means of communication, such as mobile phones. More than 60% of them today have these devices. So, Frishta Karim, how would you describe the role of the media, both informal and formal media, in the functioning of democracy and society in Afghanistan? Specifically, artists in Afghanistan today are in a very dangerous situation. Is art vital to democracy? Thank you for that question. I believe that the inroads made towards freedom of the arts and the press started in 2002. Back in 2002, you weren't even allowed to speak up in the street. You weren't even allowed to listen to music. But over the last 18 years, we have really pushed forward. People now have access to a lot of media. Most people have access to televisions or at least radios. We have more than 200 TV and radio channels, and over these 18 years of progress, we have seen rapid change. Now you can sing, you can discuss, you can debate, you can think, you can share. And this means that the people can communicate now and can mix beyond borders. The people can now communicate beyond our borders and can break away from the vice-like grip of the Taliban and communicate with the people outside. I believe that our government that has a lot of experience is a post-war government that supported freedom of expression, and people now are free to choose their president, for example. There is political opposition, and we may even today be surprised that this political opposition exists because we went through some very dark times. Today, the Afghan people can have an impact on democratic life. Over the last few months, we've seen a media campaign stating that Afghan women do not want to go back. And that is a strong voice addressed to the Taliban, the government, and also the international community that Afghan women do not want to go back, are involved in a peace process, and want women to be seen as serious and important players on the political scene. So, in this way, the media have been able to communicate this message and to show the political will before political action. We've also seen many people who have given their lives for this cause. I know people close to me who lost their lives working for newspapers. And those people did not die in vain. They were part of the positive impact of all of these actions, and we must support this peace process, no matter what form it may take, but in a democratic and free way. Article 10 of the Constitution on Development and the Economy encourages private companies in compliance with the law and the market economy to act. We're seeing microfinance, we're seeing banks in Afghanistan that could help companies, but because of the low profile of the government, companies have to take over a lot more responsibilities related to infrastructure, communication, and healthcare. Mary Akrami, in Afghanistan, are we seeing an entrepreneurial infrastructure developing, and what is the position of women in that? Thank you for that question. Over the last 17 years, Afghanistan has moved forward in industry. This applies to the private sector, but also to the public sector. Women have also taken on a significant role in the economy. Women can now be involved in trade, be it small scale or large scale. They can be involved in manual labor, agriculture, also packaging of manufactured goods. These small companies didn't used to exist, but today we are seeing that they are controlled by women. And these small companies are a part of the country's economy. There are 1,150 companies that are managed by women today in Afghanistan, and there are 68 million that have been invested in these companies for the benefit of the economy as a whole. In Kabul, there's an industrial campus where 300 women work together. Women have a role to play in trade and in industry. Another important thing that I wanted to mention is that the Afghan government has always protected the private sector and has always protected women. The current president of Afghanistan has given instructions so that all state organizations work more with women. And this serves to strengthen the role of the women running these companies. This also helps to encourage investment and to encourage overseas expansion of these companies. I would like to thank the stakeholders and members of the international community for helping us organize all of this. Without the help of the international community, we would not have been able to achieve what we have. And I would request of the international community to not stop supporting us until we are truly autonomous economically. Thank you very much for that answer. Mr. de Mistura, we have discussed a number of areas of progress for Afghanistan. As an external observer, have you seen this progress and what form has it taken? First and foremost, you were told today what Afghanistan used to be. What it used to be when women had no power, no influence, but were victimized. Here we have heard 5 women telling us about the progress that they have seen. And we should look at the positive side of all of this. The real fear is that we may lose this progress. They didn't mention it because they are proud. Afghan people have been a proud people for 4,000 years, but they are maybe not fearful, but concerned. So are we, that all of this progress may be wiped out over a week or a month. The danger that comes from losing this progress is a real issue. 17, 18 years of war is a long time, and a lot of people are wondering why we should stay in Afghanistan. But you need to stay until everyone is properly prepared. It's very easy to get into a conflict, but very difficult to get out of it without leaving chaos. An example of that would be Libya. Thank you very much, and thank you, ladies, for your answers. It's now time to move on to our second round table. So if you would please leave your seats to the participants at the next round table. Thank you. Okay, so we can now move to some of the darker sides of what's going on in Afghanistan. 140,000 soldiers were deployed to Afghanistan at the height of the war in 2011, tens of thousands deaths, both military and civilian, and since 2014 the international community has been pulling out of Afghanistan. The lack of security, resistance from the Taliban, and the international environment has discouraged the countries that sent military forces to Afghanistan and has discouraged international aid. Since 2001, international aid the international community sent $10.3 billion to Afghanistan, and given the funds sent, you might have thought that it would have improved the situation of the economy and the people, but many people today agree that humanitarian aid did not significantly help the country. It is said that aid went to warlords, urban areas, and into the pockets of corrupt individuals rather than to the mainly rural population. Afghanistan today depends on the external financing that greases the wheels of corruption across the world. Rosana Vadak, what contributed to making international aid effective or not, and how did it help develop parallel economies and corruption in politics?
با اجازه شما میخوایم راجع به رقمی که بر افغانستان کمک شده.
With your permission, I would just like to come back to the figures, the amounts that were sent between 2001 and 2018. I've got an opinion on those figures. Many billions of dollars were sent from the US to Afghanistan, and 95% of that aid went to people. 900 million out of the total. $900 billion were sent to organizations. Now, as you know, Afghanistan was a post-war country, and from a finance perspective, we didn't have enough experience. When we got this money in, we felt that we needed to use the money to solve all of our problems, but the way we handled that money was an issue, and we somehow forgot how to do that. There were some very important things that needed to be done with that money, and the donors and the government didn't necessarily make it so that money went to the right people. Later on, we were able to improve our management of the money. We were able to better handle the cash coming in, to better handle how it was handed out. And there came a point where all of the money coming into Afghanistan was handled by the government. We weren't actually able to use the money coming from the US because they were the ones deciding on how it should be spent. They were the ones creating the programs, and then they spent money on their own programs. And those programs didn't necessarily line up with what the government needed. So we weren't able to use that money, and that phase was not a positive experience for us. However, the money that came in from outside of the US, 127 billion, were donated especially by Europe, and some of it came from India, but also Canada and Japan. These funds were handled by the Ministry for Finance, and we were able to use them properly. And we were able to catch back up on our ability to handle the money, at least to some degree. You also mentioned corruption. You mentioned corruption, and I did say earlier that that money wasn't used properly, and that in part generated corruption, fed into corruption. When it comes to the parallel economy, so growing poppies, the Taliban prohibited growing poppies in 2001. Today, Afghanistan produces 90% of the world's opium, and it's especially used for heroin. A large part of this crop is exported, but a large part also is kept locally to be consumed by the local population. An estimated 13% of the Afghan population is addicted to opium. This is a cancer on the society, whereas Article 17 of the Constitution commits the state to fighting against the sale and use of drugs in the country. Umaya Ayubi, today, what is the state doing to fight against the production of poppies? And what can be done with the farmers to help reconvert that land to being used for something else?
بسیار خوب اگرچه دولت افغانستان اقدامات را به خاطر از بین بردن و جلوگیری از کشت خشخاش و قاچاق مواد مخدر انجام داده.
The government has worked to prohibit the production and sale of narcotics. The government has done this by trying to replace poppies with saffron production, and that has been relatively effective. But there remains the fight against the drug smugglers. A lot of them have been imprisoned, in fact. The Afghan prisons are full of drug smugglers. The law was considerably tightened as well against drug smuggling activities. The prison sentence has gone up from 10 to 20 years for drug smuggling offences. However, well, of course, there were pesticides that were spread on some of the poppy fields, but I would like to come back to how the war actually didn't stop poppy production. In fact, on the contrary, it increased it. And today we do have a lot of people who are addicted to drugs, especially in the regions that were controlled by the Taliban. In these areas, the Taliban have continued to produce poppies to finance their own war efforts, and seeing as the authorities didn't control these regions, they weren't able to stop it. Farmers work hard for years to produce things that are then going to be exported. But there are still problems. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the refrigeration necessary to produce other produce, and we end up losing a lot of things because we can't keep things long enough cold, and that means that you can't export things. What this means is that when farmers want to start exporting their produce to neighboring countries, for example, the borders are closed to them. You may have seen or heard in the press that a few months ago, Pakistan banned air travel between our two countries, claiming that it was for security reasons. The reason behind this was that a lot of the producers of fruit and other things could export to India, and that wasn't good for Pakistan. On the topic of corruption, when a farmer wants to sell to a big city, they have to move through control points controlled by transport companies, policemen, or all parts of the transport chain. And each of these people asks for money to facilitate the transaction, and this is paid for by the farmers. Furthermore, the state has not been able to help farmers in paying their taxes during the production cycle of their produce. This led to a lot of pressure on farmers, and they no longer desire to make the effort to produce things that end up stuck at a border or end up being wasted. So farmers pick whatever is easiest, and that is producing narcotics such as opium that sells for a very good price. On top of that, opium poppies do not require that much irrigation to grow. And farmers don't even need to worry about exporting it because the drug smugglers come straight to them to pick up the product. There are many other things I'd like to say, but seeing as we don't have much time, I will have to stop there, but those are the main points. In Afghanistan, insecurity and violence lead to a retreat of the police, which means that the Taliban and violent forces gain ground. Insecurity in Afghanistan is gaining as much ground as the Taliban, that control up to 30% of the country depending on the season. And in the first half of 2017, more than 6,700 security incidents occurred. Despite the return of Sharia law in the areas controlled by Taliban, violence is still ever present, especially against women and children, such as forced marriages of young girls to men, and also the way, and these are used for debt cancellations and other things. What is the impact of insecurity and violence, especially on women? Today, does the Afghan state have the means to protect Afghan women? There are multiple things to be said on the lack of security. A lot of it comes from poor management of the post-war period, but a lot of it also comes from shortfallings in the organization of the people who are supposed to facilitate the return to a safe situation. So the lack of clear direction, the lack of solution to be brought to bear against security issues, well, all of this comes from the fact that discussions have been going on only for a couple of months. And the Taliban reaction to this is to harden their stance. The Taliban are doing this to remain relevant and to maintain their clout as an organization and to show that they can be the cause of the deaths of many Taliban people. In the regions that the Taliban control, there is no access to women's fundamental rights. Women cannot go to school, girls cannot go to school, women cannot work in organizations, and their basic rights are flouted. As women, we are representatives of the people, and it has now been 18 years that the international community, well, the war has been going on for 18 years. The international community has recognized this as one of the longest wars, and we are tired of this war that is ongoing between Kabul and the other side of the country. And how can I express our feeling to the students here in the room today? We have not experienced a year without war, without insecurity. We want the international community to support us. We want the international community to support us in protecting the people of Afghanistan, because it's the people that are suffering the most. On the topic of insecurity, but here on education, in 2018, nearly half of children between 7 to 17 still do not go to school, and for the first time since 2002, the education rate is going down, especially in rural areas because of the conflict getting worse and an increase in insecurity in the country. The education situation was seen as a success after the downfall of the Taliban regime. Is this negative development purely due to the return of violence? A question for Atif Fatayeb. Thank you for that question. First of all, I would like to touch on an important point. The Taliban being driven out of the region in 2001 and the coalition's presence in Afghanistan. This was very positive, and we were able to have access to a lot of rights at the time. But we hadn't really achieved our goals, and the statistics we saw in 2018 were that 18% of women and 60% of men do not have access to training centers and to schools. Actually, that's a step back, especially compared to some of the other inroads we'd made. There are three reasons to this. First of all, war and insecurity. That is one of the key points that is related to this. Schools ended up being closed, especially girls' schools. That's a real issue. Girls are being threatened so that they don't go to school. And some girls' schools ended up being turned into boys' schools, and the schools that were in Taliban-controlled areas are being directly operated by the Taliban, and that's a real problem. People also had to move around between regions to protect themselves. So they end up not being able to go to school because they're moving around. UNICEF has said that there are 7 million young people of school age that cannot or do not go to school. Another thing is also the shortfallings within the administration. We're simply not building enough schools. We're not able to build enough schools so that we can then run them after that. But even in the regions where schools exist, the lack of administrative support for these schools, which comes alongside on top of which you have a lack of teachers, and also the culture plays against us. Culturally, education is seen as something for boys and not necessarily for girls, and these are some of the factors that explain the low education numbers that we're seeing for boys and for girls. Schools are a key way to unlock investment and to be able to get more schools, but we don't want to languish in this terrible situation anymore. Education deserves more investment, deserves better management, and the people who are handling these projects, well, more people should be appointed to handle these projects so that we can reap the benefits later.
Turning to the next question, we've seen the state seems totally unable to manage violence, insecurity in its major institutions. The results of the elections are regularly challenged. The term of the outgoing president ended since April. Presidential elections postponed to the 28th of September, and his continued presence as head of state is challenged right up to the in his political credit is zero. He's unable to reform the state. So the state, will it one day be able to discharge the role entrusted to it by citizens? And are we to conclude that the current constitution today is perhaps not satisfactory or doesn't lay the basis for a legitimate functioning state? Oh yes, this is indeed an issue of concern. Elections, peace go hand in hand. It's of prime importance today, as discussed in Afghanistan, but it's also the case throughout the world. It's a crucially important point that must be followed. We're very worried because there are two processes underway. There's peace and elections, and the two for us are key, and one must not disrupt the other. And as a woman, I have that concern because in both these areas there can be significant consequences leading to a great many setbacks in the peace process as well as elections. Unfortunately, the Afghan situation presently is not in a good place. It hasn't managed to resolve and meet the needs of its people. And that responsibility to the people, of course, creates several key challenges which today have become critical. The first is security, as we've mentioned, and it is a critical concern because there are many people who are killed owing to the lack of security, and it's getting worse. And as Afghan women, I can't walk safely in the streets, go shopping, or go and study. The first group that is concerned by this insecurity are women. Second issue, unfortunately, regards political affairs. Is facing some stark issues because the government doesn't have the necessary legitimacy to take important decisions, and that worries us hugely because whatever the important area that affects our people, the decision-making body can be affected by these decisions. And secondly, the passing of new legislation. Our culture with the democratic process that is underway, since we have many laws that have been passed and been very acceptable over the past 18 months. It's in the implementation that we face difficulties. Most of the problems concern the implementation of these laws. Other issues, there's never been an effective mechanism to meet the needs of the people, so the government doesn't solve the problems facing its country, and this government is not in the hands of the people. That must change. And the other issue that worries everyone is that the problems are still focused and the political power is in the hands of a group, a team, and that, of course, creates concerns for the other groups because they no longer find their place in the key decisions to be taken. Turning now to the Constitution, we're not in a good position either. We're not satisfied with the implementation of this Constitution. There was a study conducted a while back indicating that 58% of laws passed have not been implemented. That means that it's half the laws that are not applied because we have laws, but we're asking some real questions faced with this situation. This study also revealed that the non-implementation of these laws was due to the government or to the network of influence that existed. So the government that is normally responsible for implementing these laws, well, has really blocked things. So our constitutions are good. Constitution regard to regional level, we can consider it's very good, but we mustn't forget that the Constitution is linked to misunderstandings of these articles of the law that cannot has its own vision, and people pick and choose the subjects that as they choose, and that's unacceptable. We need a clear and transparent legal framework. There's been of late many issues faced in 2014 around the presidential elections. We faced issues, and during the elections, for various reasons, of course, there was also insecurity, which was present in many remote areas to monitor the elections. But that's not the only reason, this lack of security, but it's also linked to the way the electoral process is run, because for 7 months we were unable to announce the results. 7 months, I mean, someone who was in charge of monitoring these elections could say that it actually took us 7 months before we were able to announce the result of the election. So you imagine the 7 months, how these figures were manipulated or changed. The less said about that, the better. There was, of course, the influence of the political networks who were seeking to exert pressure on the election results to gain an advantage. And that was really a very bad experience during that electoral period. And, of course, the people didn't have really good memories of that. We want the people to have their trust restored in electoral voting, that even in regions where there's no security, accept the risk of going to the vote. Today, we are all together and we're convinced that it's high time to have a sound state that applies a transparent electoral process so that the people should not once again face issues similar to those that occurred in 2014, and that with political horse trading behind the scenes, we want there to be clear, democratic, fair elections with people who voted get the vote legally. Well, thank you for all your answers, Mr. Omar Samad. You were a member of the Afghan government. We just listed a number of failures, things that it was unable to do. Do you agree with the record that's just been presented? And would you maybe like just to return to one or other of the points addressed? Thank you to ESSEC, thank you to the Hobiols and to the students, the Afghan women who are with us, dear colleagues. Well,
I'm going to switch to English if you don't mind, so most people can understand. In the first panel, you heard a lot of good news, what Afghanistan has achieved over the last 18, 19 years, and at what cost it has achieved this. You heard about the constitutional order that is in place in Afghanistan. You heard about democracy taking root in Afghanistan. You heard about the legal system taking root in Afghanistan. You heard about education in the private sector and others, where women have played and continue and now are playing a much more important role in terms of leadership in management. And it has taken time. And that is all true, and I think we all need to take stock of that. In the second panel, you heard a lot of the issues that are preoccupying Afghans, the challenges that Afghans face, from the voices of women who come from the country and who are in different sectors. Their own experiences. They may not agree with one another on a lot of issues, but this is what democracy should be, and this is what we need to hear. And I think everybody in this room is here to hear the truth and what reality is. But my issue with panel 1 and panel 2 is that I agree with the basis of what they're saying, whether the problems are with corruption, or whether the problem is with security, whether the problem has to do with strategic planning that may have gone wrong, whether the problem is with bad governance or weak governance or mismanagement. All of these things exist in a country that has gone through 40 years of war and is still facing bloodshed on a daily basis. I will give you one very small statistics today. Something that came out today said that since 2009, which was the time when the Americans initiated the surge, which then in 2014 ended with the end of combat missions of NATO in America, 75,000 Afghan civilians have died, only in the past 9 to 10 years. This is in addition to 45,000 Afghan security forces who, according to the president of Afghanistan, have died in the past only 5 years. These are staggering numbers. These are not numbers. Each person, each life belongs to a family, belongs to a village, belongs to a city, in a town, and in a country, in a society. So we can, we can pretend that all is good, or we can pretend that all is bad. What we need to do is take advantage of these occasions to think about solutions. We need to think about where we stand today, what is happening in real terms, in real Afghanistan, not in a certain part of Kabul or a certain part of Kandahar or a certain village in this part of the country or another, under Taliban or not under Taliban control. Is we have to take a global view of what is happening, and we have to analyze that to the best of our abilities using the lessons of the last 18 years. We have in every sector, we can write books upon books of lessons learned from Afghanistan. Whether it's international funding or whether it's the Afghans spending it and allocating it. So I hope that in the next few minutes or an hour or so, we can also focus on how to learn from the experience of the last 18 years and how to turn this into a workable, practical program, knowing that we are still being attacked, knowing that the regional dynamics are changing, knowing that the United States and others have taken a strategic decision to abandon or leave, maybe now, maybe later, maybe 5 years from now, we do not know, and knowing that the Afghan people are suffering and that they need a break from 40 years of war. So I will pass it back to you, and I hope that we can focus now on ways out of this dilemma. And I want to hear from our sisters and my colleagues as to what they bring to the table and how others can benefit from that.
Yes,
thank you.
We will. Thank you very much. Alors, merci à toutes encore une fois pour d'avoir participé à cette table ronde. Nous allons maintenant passer à la troisième et dernière. Donc, je vous invite à tourner. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à tous. Donc nous allons pouvoir débuter cette troisième et dernière table ronde sur l'Afghanistan en 2019 et après. Donc au départ très ambitieux, le processus de paix en Afghanistan voulu par les Américains a été réduit à son minimum. Les forces internationales ne parvenant pas à éliminer les talibans, aujourd'hui la préoccupation seule des États-Unis est que le gouvernement afghan et que les talibans ne financent pas le terrorisme international ou ne l'aident en aucun cas, quitte à accepter l'arrivée des talibans au pouvoir. Et aujourd'hui, M. Samad, vous allez pouvoir nous éclairer là-dessus. D'autres États s'immiscent aujourd'hui dans ce processus de paix et viennent s'ingérer dans les affaires de l'Afghanistan, comme la Russie, l'Inde, le Pakistan, l'Iran, l'Arabie Saoudite ou encore le Qatar. Donc on trouve aujourd'hui de nombreuses puissances impliquées dans ce processus de paix, mais pas le gouvernement afghan. Comment est-ce possible? Pouvez-vous nous apporter quelques points d'éclairage peut-être sur les enjeux de ces différentes puissances dans les négociations et comment aujourd'hui l'Afghanistan peut-il faire pour prendre part à son futur dans ces négociations? Oh, sorry, I can do this in English. That's better. So you have lots of different geopolitical. Oh, bon, en français. Donc on constate aujourd'hui de nombreuses puissances internationales qui s'ingèrent dans ce processus.
So today there are lots of international powers involved in the peace process, but not the Afghan government. How is that possible? And how can the Afghan government take control of its future and carve itself out a place within all of these international actors?
This question of the peace process is a critical central issue right now. It is driving not only American politics, interestingly enough, to some extent, because of what Mr. Trump has decided to do with the Afghanistan policy, the South Asia policy, and the shift that took place last year in this policy towards trying to end a war. But you also have a decision that has been made in posturing that is taking place at the regional level by all of Afghanistan's neighbors and others who feel like they are stakeholders in this. You also have, of course, it has impacted politics inside Afghanistan. And so managing and juggling all these challenges is a very difficult job. Mr. Khalilzad has been given this mandate to find some kind of a solution. But obviously, he represents the United States. And his job is to make sure that he delivers on the responsibility that has been given to him. When, how, I do not know. There's a process underway. It is not an easy process. It's a very cumbersome, complex process with so many different dimensions. But it is, for the first time, a real opportunity. I think that if all of us agree, all Afghans agree, that for the first time in many, many years, Afghanistan has a chance to discuss peace. And the only element that is no longer under the Afghan tent are the Taliban. Everybody else who used to fight with each other in Afghanistan, either with each other or because of foreign interferences or foreign meddling or invasion or occupation, they are now part of the structure. They are now part of the order. The only group that is not part of the order are the Taliban. And so the big question is, how do you differentiate between what I think there are good Taliban, maybe Afghan Taliban who have some kind of affinity to their country, and those who do not and are probably much more dangerous in terms of their affiliations to terrorist groups and to foreign agendas. So for Afghans, this is a huge question as to how to approach this and how to find the right. And for that to happen, on one side, you have to have the Taliban sit at the table. On the other side, you have to have the rest of the Afghan society, including today's Afghan government, sit at the table. And all of this is happening at a time when it was discussed that elections are supposed to be taking place in the next 3-4 months. So it complicates matters even more, but I will leave it here. It's a strategic decision that was taken by the United States. I just want to say, the United States, after 9/11, has been driven by a strategy that is mostly counterterrorism. It's a counter-terroristic strategy that has driven American foreign and security policy. But as of the last 2-3 years, and maybe, Ambassador, you will agree with me, there has been a strategic shift from the United States and also from other Western countries of trying to focus away, to some extent, from this counterterrorism strategy towards what used to be the traditional great powers rivalry strategy. So now, for the Americans, it is very important to know exactly how to deal with China and Russia and India and others in a new global setting. So they are trying to manage this while countries like Afghanistan are trying to go through a transition. So we are in the middle of a transition as a result of a strategic shift that has taken place on the global scale.
Alors, merci beaucoup. On le voit aujourd'hui, les pays et les différents partis qui prennent part au processus de paix.
Today we are seeing that the countries involved with the peace process sometimes have very different interests than those of the Afghan people. Padvasha Hassan, today, does it still seem possible that the peace agreement that comes from this peace process is good for the Afghan people, despite them not being at the heart of the concerns of the people deliberating?
گرچه ترجمه را درست نشنیدم مگر فکر میکنم قسمی که فهمیدم سوال که شما داشتین در مورد پراگندگی احزاب.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure I quite caught. Can we please repeat the question, because we had an overlap with the English with the interpreting now. How can we make sure that the peace process benefits the Afghan people?
بله. روند صلح با یک اندازه چالش‌ها روبروست در افغانستان.
The peace process has encountered issues in Afghanistan. First of all, there's been no real political cohesion around this issue. The political decision makers aren't able to agree, and the government isn't able to agree either. That's a real problem. There's also interference going on from domestic forces and external forces. The domestic interference comes from conflict between various political forces in the country, and this has an impact on the peace process. This means that Afghan politicians have not been able to actually agree on any common ground. But we're also seeing foreign interference from the US, for example. The Americans wanted to do things that didn't necessarily match with what the Afghan people needed or wanted, and that led to diverging opinions. But what I wanted to get to was the Afghan women. We are very aware of our surroundings, and I believe that we can have a very positive impact on the process. I believe that we should focus on this topic through various organizations. Women's rights activists can come together, find common ground, have discussions, and I believe it's important that we continue to forge forward on this field of political negotiation. The aim is to create a political team that has shared ideas. We believe that when the Afghan people unite around a single idea, it is beneficial not just for the future of Afghanistan, but it also serves to give a common goal to everyone in Afghanistan. Over the last years, we have been able to achieve some things through women's actions and to achieve a modicum of peace. Thank you. Masuda Karoki, the current Afghan government doesn't have much influence on the peace process. Do you believe that the government will remain a non-player until the end? How can they become involved? And what do you think that would lead to? The Afghan government, with the president of Afghanistan, have been able to do things from a legal perspective. They've been able to implement decisions. They are legitimate through the votes that brought them to power. Article 64 that was approved by the government is particularly important in this regard. According to Article 64, the Afghan Senate must defend the interests of the people. So through these articles, we have tools that the government can use to act. Some things have been done, such as recently the US have expressed a desire to negotiate with the Taliban. And after a 6th round of negotiations with the State Department, they are now moving forward with negotiations. The government must make sure to use the opportunities that are offered to it, because domestic policy depends on foreign policy. The main cause of concern of a government must be its people. And if the government is to be supported by the people, it must fight against corruption and must fight against influence networks. When it comes down to it, the whole peace process revolves around preventing these negative effects. The current government must work hard against these forces and also find agreements with political opposition. There are also people who are very close to the government but also very close to the Taliban. So the government could directly negotiate with the Taliban through these intermediaries, but that seems to have been forgotten for the time being, and we are looking towards foreign countries to solve our domestic issues. Other solutions may come from foreign policy but nearby countries. Neighboring countries can and should help us help return peace to Afghanistan and stop settling their differences on Afghanistan. So the issues with India, Pakistan and Iran shouldn't be done in Afghanistan, and the international community must be won over. The international community must believe that the Afghan government, with the Afghan people through the processes that have been implemented, can achieve success. We know that the country of Afghanistan has been in chaos for the last 40 years because of a number of reasons, and all sorts of foreign entities are trying to solve their issues on Afghan soil. But it's all very complicated because the peace process that started a while ago is a process that also involves Iran and Russia, and the peace process is trying to solve the differences between Iran and the US, and that is a real obstacle for it.
So, as we can see, women are said to be the big losers of the peace process. On the one hand, the Taliban, if they come to power, want to establish an Islamic emirate that is totally based on Sharia law. And on the other hand, the Americans, who thus far were presenting themselves as champions of human rights and women's rights, want to exit whatever the cost for Afghan women. So, Maria Krami, do you think there's hope for women and their rights in the peace process today? Thanks. I'd like to answer your question in two parts regarding the situation of women, which is a political concern, because the peace process, when it was put in place, I mean, unfortunately, once again, we wanted Afghan women to play an active part in this process, and that didn't happen. Officially, women weren't able to take part. And I'm very sorry to see that for political reasons, Afghan women were unable to take part in that process. There were even Taliban who joined the process, whereas women, or the Afghan people were not fully included in the process. The Afghan people's convinced that by resisting, Afghan women can come together, and in this peace process work on key points such as consultation, meetings, and be able to convey, to act as spokeswomen for the Afghan people, to convey their grievances and bring them to the negotiating table, even if these discussions were not official discussions, but it should be the discussions that they be brought to the Taliban, because Afghan women are not those of 80 years ago. The Afghan women of today can work politically. All this demonstrating that both as regards the government in committees where there were 5 women, and also the campaigns that we conducted ensured that the US Congress supported us in defending women's rights. As a letter sent to President Trump, and that was a request, the fact that the process must include Afghan women in the process, that they can have an important decision-making role in running the country and assume their responsibilities. And very fortunately, that made it possible for us to convince politicians, and even the Taliban were able to see that they also talk to women. And I can say to you without a doubt that Afghan women, in the work they did, I wanted to, it's the first time I'm in France, I'll ask the French people to support us through their voice, to support Afghan women in our country, and that we can be a symbol of peace and friendship at Global Women and display a very positive image, as long as there's not any political disagreement, because those who are here, as we are, convinced that women's rights and progress should come together. So Afghanistan appears like a fragmented society because of ethnic divisions, and the relations are very fraught. Is that a problem in Parliament? Can you work together to overcome these ethnic rivalries in the context of current negotiations, where Afghanistan must stand united in the face of the possibility of the advent of a Taliban government?
تشکر میکنم. شما میفهمین که مسئله آمدن اجماع سیاسی در پروسه صلح یکی از اولویت‌های صلح است.
Thank you for that question. Well, the peace process is a really critical point that's linked to internal and external factors. So it really is an absolute energy we must put in place. Issues in common affecting the Afghan people, and that all politicians must realize that without putting in place a peace plan to bring about this peace, but unfortunately the issues that we had in the parliament, we were not able to achieve that because there isn't one shared voice in favor of the peace process. The parliament is impacted by internal political rivalries and the interests of certain groups. Afghanistan, as you know, is made up of different ethnic groups, and the 40 years of war has been even more divisive within the population. So the goal of securing peace has different meanings according to the ethnic group that hears it, because even in Parliament I was able to say it doesn't have a shared voice for the peace process. So there's a national determination that has been. We haven't seen that happen yet. Do the Afghans still expect something from this peace process? What are the threats, the hopes, the fears felt by Afghans regarding the outcome of the peace process? Well, I would say that when we had the peace process that got underway there, of course, the people hope that we will be able to put an end to terrorism, terrorist attacks in Afghanistan, and secure peace and security. I mean, that's what the Afghan people want, and that's what we hope for the peace process, is to defend the true values of. We've been able to see that there are genuine values present, and we want the peace process to last and be upheld by the values of democracy. But let's not forget that even then we seek to obtain benefits linked to the peace process, we're at the same time extremely worried by the situation that might result after the peace deal. There are three risks. There's concern about restricting the role of women in the peace process. We're still hearing the sound of the whip when the Taliban were operating in Kabul. No one's forgotten that. So there's absolutely no guarantee that Taliban have changed that much in their attitude. The second point is the restriction in the fundamental rights enjoyed by the Afghan people, conferred by the constitution that was law-based. But these past few years, when the Taliban were in power, the number of people executed against ethnic groups, that will never be forgotten. The scorched earth in the north of Afghanistan and even east and west of Afghanistan, that won't be forgotten either. And we're worried that the current situation on the cover of the current peace process will lead to a scorched earth policy and terror wrought on ethnic groups. And our third concern is that we might lose the achievements of the past 18 years. It's been a long road, hand in hand with the European community. These past 18 years, we experimented democracy, the constitution, the fundamental freedoms were officially recognized thanks to the constitution. And can peace in Afghanistan be reduced by not taking into account the fact that over the past, 18 years ago, both ourselves and the international. So we hope that the peace process can come about, but it doesn't exclude our concerns, because we experience many lost lives, and we mustn't forget that what we have obtained these past 18 years is the result of the lost lives and also the support of the international. There are women in America, in Canada, in Australia. The international community fought hand in hand with the Afghan security forces and gave their lives. So there are mothers who lost their children, and what has been won should not be lost. The past 18 years is really the fruit of the results of the efforts who gave their lives from the international community, but also at Afghan. So we can only protect that at a time when there's no longer any war, that the peace process be viewed as a way of not paving the way for future wars. We must respect people who gave their lives for that and take that account for the peace process to come.
Merci. Merci à toutes. Staffan de Mistura.
Staffan de Mistura, I'd ask you to be as brief as possible. Unfortunately, how today can women make their voice heard more loudly in the peace process? Don't you want to give the final word to women? I'll do that if they so wish. Okay, we'll have some Q&A. They'll be able to speak if they wish. Let me tell you a short anecdote. It's probably the best way because it's first-hand. The UN helped to organize the elections. It was the second elections. And at some point, the government authorities were not happy with the result. That's life. Elections, you win them and you lose them. But they weren't very happy with the result. They said, right, we're not going to open parliament because we have to change the result. And I said, well, I consulted the international community and I consulted the Afghan women. And then I decided to say, well, if the parliament's not open, we will open the new parliament with the elected women in a hotel. Who were the first to say, we're ready, the parliament can be even there. He's under a tree everywhere. If it's in a hotel, but the parliament will be open. Answer, the women, the Afghan women. And when we saw that, well, obviously those who wanted to block the opening of the parliament because they were unhappy with the result opened the parliament and women entered first. That and the strength of the Afghan women, if we give them the opportunity to have that. Okay, thank you. So we're coming to the end of the panel sessions. We're now going to move to the questions. So for practical reasons, let's start with the questions from the US. So the first question is, you've spent a week together here, working together, forging strategies for a better future for your country to build it. How do you see the next steps of your cooperation after you go back to Kabul? You as a group, that you formed today.
تشکر. ما قسمی که ما در اینجا آموختیم و پیش از اون ما ذکر کردیم که خوشبختانه زنان افغانستان از پیش منسجمتر و بسیجتر شدن و ما چیزهایی را آموختیم در اینجا که بخصوص پلانایی که ما سرش کار کردیم و امروز هم پلانای عمل خود که جور کردیم مستقیما بخیر بعد از اینکه میریم سر از کار میکنیم و یکی
worked on plans that can be implemented. We are very much united. We're going to be working on those plans. And the first thing that we're going to do, although that initiative already got underway, we want that with courage, that with the Afghan women, we're going to meet on these issues in the interest of the Afghan people and not for their own interests. So for Afghan women, it's possible that they must, during this union, work hand in hand on these projects, and you will get feedback on the implementation of these projects. And in addition to these questions, I can say that for several days that we've spent together, and the things that we've done, that it wasn't as methodical as what we learned today. So we've made progress in building expertise, putting in place better organized processes, and the action plan that we had together, that we were able to compare it, to implement it in Afghanistan with the help of the men, women, and God, continue our struggle. So, for a question for Mr. Mistura. Mr. Samad, in your view, is it possible for the Taliban to totally regain power in Afghanistan? Mr. de Mistura, what would your advice be for real inclusion of Afghan women in the peace process? That's a very good question. Is it possible for the Taliban to take total power in Afghanistan, to assume total power in Afghanistan?
Anything is possible, unfortunately, in politics, when the wrong decisions are made, especially when the wrong decisions are made. And so what we need to avoid is to reach the wrong decisions. And the process has to be as transparent and as inclusive as possible, so that all the key voices are heard, including women's voices, with all its diversity, and that a consensus is built in order to put the Taliban in a position where they have no choice but to negotiate in good faith. That cannot happen unless what some of our colleagues mentioned here, we are able, as an Afghan political society, with all its diversity, to have an inclusive approach with a strategy that reflects the will of the majority of the Afghan people, men and women, and the political will to put aside small, short-term political gain in favor of long-term national interest. That is the key to finding a solution. Otherwise, unfortunately, the momentum is such right now that prolongation of war and another few years of combat, whether with or without foreign regional support, will be to the detriment of the Afghan people, will be to the detriment of the constitutional order with any type of change that could come to it, or any type of amendment that the Afghan people would accept, and that it would unfortunately empower and enforce the rule of extremism and violence. And the Taliban would benefit from that. And those who support the Taliban in our region and that mindset would benefit from that. So it is absolutely essential that at this critical moment, where the only opportunity that has again presented itself over all these years has to be dealt with responsibly. And I stress on the word responsibly, both by the Americans, the rest of the international community, and Afghan political society.
Merci. Et Monsieur de Mistura, donc pour l'inclusion des femmes dans ce processus de paix, comment cela se traduit-il en pratique?
In the peace process, how is this playing out in practical terms? Well, I don't want to repeat my third point, which basically summarized my thoughts on the matter. Up until now, I have always supported civilians, and I was sent to Afghanistan 4 times, so I fully understand and respect the willpower of the Afghan people, especially Afghan women. So the key word here to me is inclusion. But inclusion also of the Taliban. Of course, that's the reason why we are talking to them. They are Afghans. But you shouldn't be excluding minorities, and that means most of women. Inclusivity means sustainable peace, and if it isn't there, then the peace you achieve will be fragile. Frichte Karami, a message for you. This isn't a question. Your husband is saying, I am proud of you and I will always support you. Keep going. Okay, we can now move on to questions from the audience here. We're going to be handing around some microphones. Could you please bunch up your questions so we can have a batch of 2 or 3 to answer? And anyone can feel free to answer, not only the women sat around the table now. Thank you very much for allowing me to answer a question. My question is for the MPs who are here. What propositions have you been able to put to the French government? And what parallels can be drawn between France and Afghanistan with relation to organizations or other things? So what kind of propositions have you made? And then a question from Mr. Samad, former ambassador. What is your vision and what is your perspective on the progress made by women over the last years? Good morning, everyone. My name is Neema Sass. I'm from Afghanistan. I would like to ask a question to the women who have joined us here today. Sisters, it's an honor to have you here with us today. And I may ask my question in French because we do have interpreters. Now we're looking at the consequences of the war in Afghanistan. but not so much the causes. What's at stake here today is a peace process and the stakeholders in that peace process. But these are the people who caused the war in the first place in Afghanistan. If you look at the people who are going to Russia or elsewhere, the Afghan state represents the Afghan people and is being excluded from this peace process. That's my first point. Secondly, the Afghan people in Russia or elsewhere do not represent Afghanistan. If you look at the money they left with, they are the ones who have all of the international aid that was sent to Afghanistan. A large part of that aid was eaten up by the warlords. How should we expect of the people who caused the war and who live from war any solution? They are part of the peace process, but how can we expect them to bring about peace? Who can bring peace? It's not the people who live from war today. We should make no mistake. As to the role of women, if you look at the Afghan constitution in 1955, we had things back in 55, in 64 as well. We had democracy, we had elections in 64. I think that rather than discussing freeing women, men need to be freed from their own minds. They have been educated in a certain way. They need to be freed from the prison in their minds so that Afghan women can be freed. Thank you very much for that question. Before coming to France this time, myself and some of my family members went to the French Institute in Kabul. At the French Institute, there is a place to read literature, there's a place to appreciate art, and that French Institute is financed by the French government. It's a place of culture and it's autonomous, although it does support Afghanistan. Now, today you can't really see the results necessarily yet, but investing in educating young people is the best kind of investment that the French government could make. I don't know quite the exact nature of the relationship between France and Afghanistan, but I know there are Afghan students that come to study in France. And maybe now it is time for men and women not just to chant slogans, but to support people where they need to be supported. And we should benefit from foreign support, and we would support women anywhere in the world where they cannot get access to their rights. The French people are a people who can help Afghan women. And a second thing, just to follow up on what was just said, The war has dragged on, and one of the issues that we have in Afghanistan is that we don't have a shared strategy to implement the peace process. What is the price of peace? What are we willing to put on the table? As the people of Afghanistan, we don't actually know what is being discussed, what is being said. Most Afghans do not believe they are prisoners in their head, in their own head, like you just said. They actually think that they are in a position of power, that they have information. We have politicians in Afghanistan that travel around the world as well. I am a journalist, but I don't want this to be heard as from a journalist, but rather as someone who was affected by the war. These are people who have created the warlike policies of the last 40 years, and I can honestly say that the war in Afghanistan is a men's war. But the people who are the first affected by the war are the women in Afghanistan. My feeling today is that I hope that you or your children, if you have a little boy, if your little boy ends up discussing things, my hope is that it is women who will guide his ideas in the future. I would also like to speak about French financing. France does not accept many scholarships. I would like to state here today that the number of scholarships is not high enough. Afghan people want to study, and we would like there to be more scholarships accepted. And to answer the question that was just asked us, it's not just about people who have traveled abroad. We've already had 6 roundtables in Qatar and elsewhere. But the first people who are concerned by this are the Afghan people, and they are not being consulted. We have no idea what was discussed in Qatar, for example. As I'm sure you have seen over the last 18 years, we've made a lot of progress, and we have had to endure many things that happened over the last 18 years, but there were also memorable moments as well. These last 18 years have transformed the condition of Afghan women, who are no longer the same as they were 18 years ago. Things have changed for women's rights, for women's freedom. Because you cannot have a strong foundation for peace without a policy that takes into account the opinions of all of the people. A final question? A very brief question, because we are very late. Please keep it as short as you can. I work for the Afghan security forces here at the embassy in Paris. Currently, there are more than 2,000 women in the Afghan armed forces who serve for their country, and they are very proud of their position within the Afghan army. Their ranks go all the way up to lieutenant colonel, and they represent about 1% of the overall army population, and the army has decided to increase that to 10%. I think that that is something that's very significant. Lots of women are going to be able to get into the army. On the issue of corruption in the army, I think that there are problems in all armies, but we shouldn't forget that the Afghan army fights against 20 groups of terrorists, and that is not easy. It's not easy to fight 20 terrorist groups at the same time. But there are problems in any country around the world. We're dealing with our own, and we want to improve. We want to have a good government and a good state. That's just a bit of follow-up information. Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who organized this conference, and ladies, thank you for coming. A question for Mr. de Mistura. Mr. Yamamoto, the representative of the Secretary General in Afghanistan, stated that we have never been closer to a concrete solution to the conflict between the government and the Taliban. With your experience of the Syrian conflict and with your experience of how difficult it can be to get different parties around the table, what do you think of that statement? Do you believe that we can achieve that in your experience? I'm a diplomat at heart, so in that tradition I would not contradict my successor, but I do have a lot of hope in Mr. Yamamoto. I think that what he said is actually something that we heard echoed here today. It takes two to dance, but it also takes two to achieve peace. And up until now, the Taliban were not willing to discuss peace. The only people they may have been willing to talk to were the Americans, not with the Afghans, because they believe that they're on the same level as America and therefore above the Afghan government. There will come a point where the government will have to go through where the negotiations will have to go through the government. And when that opportunity arises, we need to not miss it. It's much better to negotiate than to make war on each other. So in that regard, he was right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I think we have come to the end of our questions in the room. That's the end of the debate. Thank you for coming in, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being involved. We do have some light refreshments outside, available now in the cafeteria, I believe. May I just say one thing before we wrap up? Congratulations to both of you and to all of the students. When I was your age, I would not have been able to do what you did this evening. Well done. And a final word from one of our guests.
خانم‌ها و آقایان، شامتان بخیر. اجازه بدهید تا تشکر کنم از دانشگاه اسک و تمام دستاندرکاران این برنامه، به ویژه فهیمه و تانیا روبیل، این کارگاه را که برای ما گذاشته بودند.
I would like to thank everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'd like to thank the ESSEC. I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in this event. We really have been able to push forward towards our goals. My colleagues, the people here up on stage, are from Afghanistan, and we all want to improve the situation in Afghanistan and to improve the position of women. Every day we work towards peace, and that fight cannot happen without the input from women. We mustn't forget the needs of women and the needs of the Afghan people, and without taking into account these things, peace cannot be sustainable. We would like to ask the international community to support women in Afghanistan. This is the fight that needs to happen if we are to achieve a fair situation. We need to show the real face of Afghan women. And I would like to say that the Afghan women do not want to go back. You could summarize our position by saying that we will never go back, and there is a red line that we will not cross. I would like to thank everyone who is involved with organizing this to come up on stage with us to receive a small gift from our delegation.
میخوام اضافه کنم که تحایفی که امروز ما به شکل یک هدیه بر شما اهدا میکنیم.
I would also like to add that the gifts that we have brought for you here today were handmade in Afghanistan by women. And it was made in places where people used to grow opium poppies, but no longer. And I would like to first of all thank Mrs. Robiol, Fahimi Robiol, thank you. And I would also like to thank Tina Robiol. And also Mr. Omar Samad, former ambassador. Thank you very much. I'm forgetting someone. The dean who will get a headscarf. I also wanted to thank the students who have helped us this evening. His Excellency the Ambassador appears to have left. Thank you, everyone. We now have refreshments in the cafeteria. Remember to return your interpreting headsets as you leave the room, please. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.